20 minutes of highway was all that stood between Anne Harmeyer and the campus where the rest of her life was waiting. Her car never finished the trip, and somewhere on a stretch of road she knew well, she got into a vehicle that wasn't hers and disappeared. 5 weeks later, a farmer picking corn found what remained of her body dumped out in his field. Nearly half a century since, no one has ever been charged, and whoever did this may still be out there, running out the clock before justice catches up with him. Anne grew up in Cambridge City, a small town in eastern Indiana close to the Ohio line. She was an only child, and her father, a local attorney, passed away when Anne was just 4 years old. This left her to be raised by her mother, Marjorie, a music teacher who taught in the local schools and gave piano and voice lessons on the side. By the autumn of 1977, Anne was 20 and heading into her junior year at Indiana University in Bloomington. Both of her parents had studied there, so she'd grown up coming down for games and walking those quads long before she ever enrolled. She'd chosen theater, and by every account she'd flourished in it. That September, Anne had come back to Cambridge City for the weekend to visit a friend who was in the hospital. She'd meant to drive back to Bloomington on Sunday night, but Marjorie didn't like the idea of her daughter on the highway after dark. She talked Anne into waiting until Monday morning instead, figuring the daylight would be safer. So on the morning of Monday, September 12th, 1977, Anne set out in her rust-colored 1971 Pontiac Le Mans, a muscular two-door she was fond of. Bloomington was roughly a 2-hour drive, and she had a 10:30 class she didn't intend to miss, but she never got there. Her route took her onto State Road 37, the highway linking Indianapolis and Bloomington, a road she knew well. The car, though, was struggling, and she stopped at more than one gas station along the way to have someone look it over. The last of those stops came only about 10 miles from where the vehicle finally gave out. Investigators would later track down the people who'd seen her that morning, and every one of them checked out. The Pontiac came to rest on the shoulder of State Road 37, about 2 miles north of Martinsville and only 20 minutes shy of campus. When it was found, the doors were locked, the hazard lights were blinking, and the car was pointed south, toward Bloomington. The radiator had run dry and the engine had overheated, the result of a faulty thermostat. Anne's laundry, her books, and most of her belongings were still sitting inside. Despite this being the 1970s, the alarm went up quickly, because Anne simply wasn't the type to vanish. She was diligent to a fault, and rarely missed a class, so when her 10:30 seat sat empty, people noticed right away. She also hadn't called her mother to say she'd arrived, the way she'd promised, which was completely out of character for her. Later that day, she failed to turn up for a theater rehearsal, and her castmates found that strange as well, though nobody reported her missing at the time. Marjorie, meanwhile, had been phoning her daughter's off-campus apartment over and over with no answer. Near midnight, she and a friend got in a car and retraced the route to Bloomington themselves. That's how they came across the locked, abandoned Pontiac on the side of the highway. They drove to the nearest police station and reported that something had gone badly wrong. What followed was one of the largest searches the area had ever seen, and the cops used an innovative strategy to try to drum up eyewitness accounts. The Indiana State Police and the Morgan County Sheriff's Department threw real weight behind it, with as many as 7 officers working the case full-time at its peak. At one point, they hauled Anne's car back out to the highway where it was found and ran a rolling road check. They flagged down drivers to ask whether they'd passed that vehicle a week earlier or seen anyone near it. Unfortunately, despite this effort, no new tips or evidence came from this attempt. Back in Cambridge City, the town organized itself, holding regular meetings to figure out how to keep Anne's name in front of people. At the time, without our current technology, that meant flyers, printed and posted up and down State Road 37, and across central Indiana. This effort led to the story climbing all the way to the national news. Marjorie made a public appeal that few who saw it ever forgot, begging whoever knew anything to tell her where her daughter was, alive or otherwise. The answer, when it came, was the one no parent wants. On October 18th, 1977, 36 days after Anne went missing, a farmer was picking corn in a field, roughly 7 miles northeast of Martinsville, when he found her body. The spot was about 200 yards off a county road, hidden in corn that stood more than 7 feet tall. The cornfield lay only a few miles from where her car had failed, so wherever she'd been taken, she hadn't been carried far. From the beginning, there was little doubt it was Anne in that field. She was still wearing an Indiana University t-shirt, and she was identified through her clothing, her dental records, and a purse found nearby. The scene told an ugly story, and one of her own shoelaces had been used to bind her hands behind her back, and the other had been used as a ligature. Despite finding her body, this didn't lead to any new breaks in the case, and the case ended up sitting on the shelf, cold. For a long time, Anne's own family believed the case had actually effectively been solved. The understanding that filtered down to relatives was that the man responsible had been caught and fried, and the name attached to that belief was Stephen Judy. Stephen Judy was put to death in Indiana's electric chair in March 1981 for the 1979 annihilation of an entire 4-person family. Before his execution, Judy spoke openly about other crimes and confessed to several more, some in other states. When he was asked about Anne, though, he said flatly that he'd had nothing to do with her and didn't even know who she was. Police at the time didn't buy it, but as it turns out, the denial seems to hold up, and this sick puppy may actually have been telling the truth. A later review by the cold case detectives on file placed Stephen Judy likely in the Marion County Jail on September 12, 1977, the very day Anne disappeared. Unfortunately, the specific jail records have since been lost or thrown out, which complicates things. However, by putting together the court records, they were able to determine that he was likely in lockup since that spring. Given that the jail records are gone, not everyone is entirely satisfied Stephen Judy didn't do it. However, this was a man who clearly wanted to take credit for as much suffering as possible, and despite that, he didn't admit to doing it. Personally, I believe that he's not responsible for the crimes against Anne, based on both his denial and the evidentiary record. That said, I do admit that there's always a possibility that he figured he could inflict more suffering on the family by maintaining a denial when he actually did it. Decades on, it was a news story that pulled Anne's case out of the back of a filing cabinet when her cousin approached investigators with a new technique that could solve the case. In 2018, the arrest of the Golden State Killer in California, cracked open by genetic genealogy, made him wonder why his cousin's case couldn't be next. He filed a Freedom of Information request for Anne's cold case file, but was turned down, since the investigation is still ongoing and active. The police have been tight-lipped about what they have, but there is at least genetic evidence that was recovered from the scene. It's been tested more than once, but as of yet, this evidence doesn't yet appear to have been sent for genetic genealogy testing. Personally, I think we've really got to get on funding genetic genealogy tests for all cases such as this. At the end of the day, every year that passes makes it more unlikely that the perpetrator will ever face justice for his crimes. 45 minutes after the President of the United States was shot in front of hundreds of witnesses, a patrol officer in a quiet corner of Dallas slowed his cruiser. He was pulling up beside a lone man walking along a residential street, and nobody can say for certain what made him stop. Nobody knows exactly what passed between them through the open window of that police car. What we do know is that within a minute, The officer was lying in the road with 4 bullets in him, and the attacker was already walking away. The officer's name was J.D. Tippit, and for more than 60 years he's been remembered, when he's remembered at all, as a footnote to a far larger crime. Tippit was born in September 1924 near Anona in Red River County, the eldest of 7 children in a farming family of modest means. In an odd footnote, he was simply just named J.D., and the initials didn't actually stand for anything at all. He grew up on the land, was raised in the Baptist church, and left public school after the 10th grade, a fairly unremarkable upbringing at the time. When he was 15, the family moved to a stretch of dirt road southwest of Clarksville, and that part of the world stayed in him for the rest of his life. He entered the Army in the summer of 1944 and volunteered to be a paratrooper, which indicates an incredible amount of bravery and a strong martial spirit. By early 1945, he was in Europe, attached to a parachute infantry regiment in the 17th Airborne Division, a unit that had seen heavy action in the Battle of the Bulge. He jumped into combat during the airborne crossing of the Rhine that March, one of the largest operations of its kind ever attempted, and he came home with a Bronze Star. He stayed in uniform until the middle of 1946 before being honorably discharged. Back in Texas, he married Marie Frances Gassaway just after Christmas that year, and the two of them went on to raise 3 children. For a while, he tried his hand at cotton farming, but it didn't pay. And in 1952, he traded the fields for a badge and joined the Dallas Police Department. He spent the next 11 years patrolling Oak Cliff, a working-class residential district south of the river. The pay wasn't much, so he picked up part-time work on the side, cooking at a barbecue restaurant on weekend nights and helping out at a neighborhood theater on Sundays. By the autumn of 1963, he was 39 years old, a dependable beat cop with a family and 2 extra jobs. Nobody outside his neighborhood had any reason to know him, that is, until his whole life would intersect with the forces of history. At noon on the 22nd of November 1963, 3 shots rang out across Dealey Plaza, and President Kennedy slumped in the back of his open limousine. Within minutes, the Dallas police radio became a wall of noise, every available unit being pulled toward the center of the city to seal it off. Tippit was working his usual beat that day, in South Oak Cliff, several miles from the chaos that was rapidly unfolding. He knew the district about as well as a man can know a place after 11 years of driving its streets. At about 1:15, the dispatcher ordered him to move into the central part of the area as the department tried to throw a net around downtown. He acknowledged the order, and a few minutes later radioed in to confirm he'd repositioned as instructed. By then, a description of the suspect had started going out over the air. It was vague, the kind of thing that could fit thousands of men in the area. A slender white male in his early 30s, somewhere around 5'10", weighing about 165 pounds. The man who'd soon cross his path was younger, shorter, and lighter than that, but in the rush of a city in panic, the description may have been close enough to put a careful officer on edge. Tippit never radioed in to report that he was approaching the unknown man, so his intent in the approach remains unknown. About 1:30, Tippit was rolling slowly eastward along East 10th Street, about 100 feet past its intersection with Patton Avenue. This was a residential stretch lined with fairly modest houses and parked cars along the street. A man was walking on the sidewalk, and something about him evidently caught the officer's attention. Tippit pulled the cruiser over alongside him. Why he singled out that particular man, on that particular block, remains an unsolved mystery. The man walked over to the passenger side of the car and leaned toward the open vent window, and the two of them exchanged a few words. Whatever was said, it was brief. Tippit opened his door and stepped out, and he began to walk around toward the front of the patrol car. He never made it. The man drew a revolver and started wildly blasting, firing off numerous shots in quick succession. 3 rounds landed square in Tippett's chest, and as he went down, a final shot caught him in the right side of the head. An ambulance carried his body the short distance to Methodist Hospital, where a physician formally pronounced him deceased at around 1:15. There were a remarkable number of people nearby, and roughly a dozen of them ended up named in the official record. The closest was a man in a pickup truck driving the other way. He saw the officer standing by his car and the second man on the far side, heard the shots, and watched Tippett drop. He stayed low in his truck until the attacker had gone, then a little longer, before he worked up the nerve to climb out. In the era before cell phones or even universally available home phones, he tried to call it in on the cruiser's radio and couldn't make it work. Another passerby managed to get through to the dispatcher, and the first word of the shooting reached headquarters only a few minutes after it happened. A used car salesman and former Marine who worked nearby saw the attacker moving off with the revolver still raised and shouted at him, getting only a muttered, unintelligible reply. A woman who'd been standing across the street watched the whole thing and picked the suspect out of a police lineup that very evening. Her account would later be picked apart by critics who found her an unreliable witness who couldn't keep her own narrative straight. However, with so many other witnesses, this was less of an impediment to the investigation than it may usually have been. 2 women who were sisters-in-law, known to history as the Davises, inside a house at the corner, heard the shots and saw the man cut across their lawn. The shooter had flipped open the cylinder of his revolver and dumped the spent casings as he moved. They later found 2 of the casings in the grass and handed them to police, creating a minor chain of custody issue on this evidence. A cab driver parked close by watched the man pass within a few feet of him, weapon in hand, grumbling something under his breath. By the end of that night, 5 separate witnesses had identified the same man in police lineups. 1 more did so the following day, 3 others later picked him out from a photograph, and 2 said only that he resembled the man they'd seen. The shells in the Davises' yard, and 2 more recovered at the scene, would become the most important physical evidence in the case against the man who'd fired them. The attacker didn't get far, and a few blocks away, the manager of a shoe shop noticed a man behaving oddly in his doorway, ducking out of sight as patrol cars went screaming past. The man then slipped into the nearby Texas Theater without bothering to buy a ticket, apparently attempting to hide among the patrons or turn it into a siege situation. The shoe shop manager pointed it out, the theater's cashier flagged the cops, and within minutes officers were converging on the theater and turning up the house lights. It was about 10 minutes to 2 when they moved in and prepared to apprehend the man who had gunned down Tippett. There was a brief scuffle among the seats, and the man tried to get some shots off, but the suspect was wrestled into custody and hauled out to a waiting car as a small crowd jeered. The man was Lee Harvey Oswald, and by that point, he was wanted for far more than a traffic stop gone horribly wrong. Late that evening, he was formally charged with the killing of Officer Tippett, and in the early hours of the following morning, he was charged with assassinating the president as well. He denied both to the end, insisting he was a patsy, that someone else had done it all, and that despite how things looked, he was innocent. The case against Oswald for the officer's death rested heavily on what was found in the street and what was found on his person when he was clapped in cuffs. The weapon was a snub-nosed Smith & Wesson revolver, taken from him during the struggle in the theater. He'd bought it months earlier by mail order under a false name, the same alias he'd used to buy the rifle that would be tied to the president's death. At the scene and in the Davises' yard, 4 spent cartridge cases were recovered. When the firearms experts examined them, they were unanimous on one point. Those 4 cases had been fired in Oswald's revolver, and in no other weapon on Earth. The bullets pulled from Tippett's body were a murkier matter, since Oswald had modified the weapon. It had been altered to chamber a slightly different cartridge than its barrel was built for, so the bullets passed through undersized and erratic, picking up inconsistent markings each time. Some have claimed that the issue with the bullets indicates that there may have been a second shooter, or that Oswald wasn't involved at all. Some theorists have even claimed that there were witnesses that claimed to have seen two men running from the scene, but that the police disregarded these witness statements. In the end, though, the evidence generally does point to Oswald being the one who attacked Officer Tippett. For me, the real unsolved mystery here isn't who shot Tippett, or even why, but rather, why Tippett decided to investigate Oswald at all. Maybe the loose description was enough to make him a suspect, but the description really didn't fit Oswald all that well. Oswald had just turned 24, and was substantially lighter than the description that was sent out. It's possible that Tippett hadn't been seeking to apprehend Oswald at all, but that Oswald simply misunderstood what was going on during a routine stop. It's entirely possible that Tippett had just intended to ask Oswald if he had seen anyone who fit the description of the shooter. Personally, I like this idea, because I find it hard to believe that Tippett wouldn't have immediately radioed in if he believed he had JFK's assassin in his sights. In the end, we'll never have a firm answer to Tippett's thoughts in those moments, because of course Tippett didn't make it, and what happened to Oswald next would change everything. Oswald, as you're probably aware, never stood trial for any of it, not for Tippett, and not for President Kennedy. 2 days after the shooting, while being moved from one jail to another in the basement of police headquarters, he was gunned down on live television. The man that did it was a local nightclub owner named Jack Ruby, and the attack was broadcast in front of a national audience. Whatever Oswald knew about his interactions with Officer Tippett that fateful day went into the grave with him. The investigation fell instead to a federal commission, which spent the better part of a year on it before concluding in the autumn of 1964 that Oswald had acted alone in both deaths. A later congressional inquiry in the 1970s reached the same verdict on the officer specifically, citing the gun in his hands and the wall of witnesses who'd put him at the scene. For the family, the grief was swallowed up by the enormity of what had happened that weekend. He'd left behind Marie and the 3 children they'd raised together. Both RFK and the new president telephoned the officer's widow to offer their condolences, and the former First Lady wrote her a letter about the bond they now shared. Money poured in from across the country, hundreds of thousands of dollars from ordinary people who'd read about her in the papers. In the end, we will never know why Tippett decided to approach Oswald, or why Oswald chose additional senseless violence on one of the most tragic days in American history. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with my somewhat annoying reminder to hit the subscription button and notification bell and turn on all those notifications. Also, don't forget to check out the membership or the Patreon if you want to take your support for my channel to the next level. Somewhere in England, a man with access to the Royal Mail's most sensitive paperwork worked out a single valuable fact: which night a particular train would be hauling more cash than any train in British history. He passed that fact to a gang of thieves, took his cut, and then disappeared so effectively that more than 60 years later, nobody can prove who he was. The robbery he set in motion became the most famous heist the country has ever seen, and he never spent a day behind bars for it. The gang knew him only as the Ulsterman, and he's the first mystery in this case, and far from the last. The train at the center of it was a traveling post office, a rolling sorting room railwaymen called the Up Special. At 10 to 7 on the evening of the 7th of August 1963, it pulled out of Glasgow Central bound for Euston in London, due to arrive just after 4 the next morning. 12 carriages, hauled by a diesel locomotive, carried 72 post office staff who sorted mail through the night as the country slept around them. The second carriage behind the engine was the one that mattered, since it had the high-value bundles of banknotes moving south between bank branches. On an ordinary night, it might hold around 300,000 pounds, still a staggering sum at the time. But this wasn't an ordinary night, and the August bank holiday had just passed. Scottish banks were flushing days of accumulated cash down to London, so the coach was loaded with somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million pounds. The post office owned high-value coaches fitted with alarms, barred windows, and reinforced locks, built so a night like this couldn't happen, but those coaches were out of service. In their place ran an ordinary reserve carriage with no alarm and no bars on the windows. The richest train in the country was, that night, also one of the softest. The mastermind was Bruce Reynolds, a Londoner who drifted from petty break-ins into serious robbery and fancied himself built for adventure. Around him stood the core of what's sometimes called the Southwest Gang. Reynolds himself, Gordon Goody, Buster Edwards, and Charlie Wilson. They were accomplished thieves, but they'd never stopped a train in their lives, and they knew it. So they brought in specialists to assist them in their efforts. A second outfit, the South Coast Raiders, had real experience robbing trains, and from them came Tommy Wisby, Bob Welch, and Jim Hussey, along with Roger Corddry. This last man could rig a railway signal to stop a train wherever he liked, so he was an invaluable asset to this train heist. The final crew ran to roughly 16 men on the ground directly involved in the great train robbery. One was a South London carpenter named Ronnie Biggs, whose name the world would remember above all the others, even though his job was almost trivial. Biggs was supposed to supply one thing: a retired driver who could move the locomotive once it was seized, and let's just say he failed miserably, but more on that in a moment. And then there was the inside man, who played perhaps the most important role of all. The whole scheme rested on knowing how much money the train carried and when, and that came from someone deep inside the postal system. The gang never learned his real name, but because of his accent, or perhaps something else, they called him the Ulsterman, meaning he was from Northern Ireland. Just after 3 in the morning on the 8th of August, the train rolled toward a quiet spot called Sears Crossing. This location was in Buckinghamshire between Leighton Buzzard and Cheddington, and Corddry had done his work. He'd covered the green signal with a glove and wired a battery to light the red lamp, so the driver saw a red stop signal the railway had never set. The driver was Jack Mills, 58 years old, a man with decades on the rails, who probably thought he had seen everything the job had to offer. He brought the train to a halt exactly as the false signal told him to, and his second man, 26-year-old David Whitby, climbed out of the train to investigate. Before he could make sense of what he was seeing, Whitby was overwhelmed and restrained by a couple of goons. Hooded men were already swarming up into the cab from both sides of the train. Mills grappled with one of them and was struck from behind by another, a blow to the head that left him bleeding and barely conscious. Then the plan nearly fell apart. The retired driver Biggs had brought along couldn't operate this newer locomotive. His experience was with older engines, and the controls in front of him might as well have come from another machine. There was no time to argue, and the gang dragged the injured Mills back to his controls and made him drive the train half a mile down the line to Bridego Bridge. There, the plotters had placed a white sheet stretched between 2 poles to mark the spot to stop. At the bridge, the gang had already uncoupled the engine and the high-value coach from the rest of the train, leaving the sorters further back with no idea what was happening up front. The handful of postal staff inside, led by a man named Frank Dewhurst, tried briefly to hold the door, but was overwhelmed. After that, there was nothing they could do. They were ordered to lie face down in the corner, and Mills and Whitby were handcuffed together and laid down beside them. What followed was almost industrial. The robbers formed a human chain and passed the mailbags out of the coach and down the embankment to a waiting truck. They cleared 120 of the 128 sacks in 15 to 20 minutes, leaving the rest only because time had run out. The haul of cash weighed around 2.5 tons. Within about 30 minutes of the train stopping, the entire convoy was gone, and to fool any witness who saw them, 2 of their getaway trucks carried the very same number plate. As they ran the back roads with a radio tuned to the police frequency, they heard the first stunned report that the train itself had been robbed. 27 miles from the bridge sat Leatherslade Farm, a rundown place the plotters had purchased 2 months previous. It was almost the perfect location, but for the fact that there were other rural folk around who may notice unusual activity at the farm. Inside, they tipped out the sacks and counted their ill-gotten gains. They had stolen around 2.5 million pounds in just 30 minutes. Divided between the men and their informants, it came to roughly 150,000 pounds a share, a colossal fortune in 1963. To pass the time while the heat died down, they played Monopoly, and they used real notes from the heist to do it, perhaps to raise the stakes of the game. In a somewhat bizarre twist, that game of Monopoly would help send most of them to prison for years. Their immediate undoing, though, was a single careless sentence spoken by one of the robbers. He told the postal workers not to move for half an hour to give the crew time to escape. Investigators turned that inadvertent clue into a circle on the map, a 30-mile radius, a half-hour drive in a fast car, and Leatherslade Farm sat inside that circle. The cops, of course, had no reason to suspect the farm itself yet, but the men weren't about to take any additional chances. Listening to the radio, the gang realized the police would be combing this exact patch of countryside, so they moved up their departure and scattered. A man hired to come back and burn the farm clean of all evidence lost his nerve and ran, and the farmhouse and everything inside it was left standing. The break came from a herdsman in a neighboring field who thought the activity at the supposedly empty farm was worth a phone call. On the 13th of August, 5 days after the robbery, 2 officers walked up to Leatherslade and found a thieves' paradise of evidence. They found trucks, sleeping bags, food, sacks stamped by the post office, banknote wrappers, and a Monopoly board. The gang had wiped the place down, but they'd missed things, and surviving fingerprints turned up on that Monopoly set, which they hadn't bothered to clean in their haste. The farm wasn't the only gift the gang handed the police. Days later, hikers nearby found briefcases stuffed with crisp banknotes, more than 100,000 pounds dumped among the trees. Tucked in with the cash was a German hotel receipt made out to Brian Field, one of the conspirators, and his wife. He was a clerk for a lawyer, and it was the thread that tied the apparently respectable man to the men who'd taken the train. By now, Scotland Yard had taken over the London end of the case under Detective Chief Superintendent Tommy Butler, a relentless, secretive man nicknamed the Grey Fox. He lived for the job and trusted no one with the full picture, not even his own squad. With fingerprints from the farm and a steady drip of inside information from informants, the names came together, and through the fall, the gang were arrested one after another. The trial opened in Aylesbury on the 20th of January 1964 and ran for 51 days, with hundreds of exhibits and witnesses in a courtroom modified to hold them all. Not every charge stuck, and one of the men walked free partway through the proceedings. His only link to the crime was his prints on that Monopoly set, and his counsel argued he'd played the game with his brother-in-law, who was involved well before the robbery. For the rest, the reckoning was severe, and in April, the judge condemned the robbery as an act of cold greed and violence. 7 of the men were handed 30 years apiece, sentences longer than many got for taking a life. That sentence makes more sense when you realize that Jack Mills, the lead train conductor, spent the rest of his life partially disabled due to the blow to his head. I have to imagine that without that senseless act of violence, the sentences may not have been so severe. There's also the fact that the majority of the money wasn't returned, and as such, these long sentences really enforce that this wasn't a paid holiday for criminals. For some of the men, 30 years was simply not a sentence they intended to serve. In August 1964, one of the men, Charlie Wilson, was broken out of Winson Green Prison in Birmingham by a 3-man team who got in and out in under 3 minutes. 11 months later, Ronnie Biggs, the one who almost screwed up the entire operation by failing to get a qualified train conductor, also escaped. He went over the wall of Wandsworth Prison with a rope ladder and into a van that was waiting for him. He then had plastic surgery in Paris, then ran to Australia, then Rio de Janeiro, where the British authorities couldn't touch him. Biggs lived in the open in Brazil for decades and only came home, old and ill, in 2001. Charlie Wilson, for his part, surfaced in Canada under a borrowed name, living a comfortable suburban life outside Montreal, joining a golf club and blending in. He stayed free until a careless invitation to a relative back home led Scotland Yard to his door, and he was recaptured in 1968. He served the rest of his sentence and was released, after which he moved to Spain, where he was gunned down in 1990. Years later, in 2014, one of the participants, a man named Gordon Goody, finally offered a name for the Ulsterman, who was never caught. He claimed this mysterious figure had been a postal worker called Patrick McKenna, then 43 years old. He was a quiet family man from Salford who'd been born in Belfast, and Goody only ever learned it by catching sight of his name written inside a glasses case. By the time anyone went looking, McKenna was long dead, and he'd died with no criminal record and very little money to his name. Plenty of people doubt that McKenna was involved at all, and instead point to an alternative figure named Sammy Osterman. Not much is known about him beyond the fact that he was on the periphery of the heist crew and was never charged. Some believe that the nickname, the Ulsterman, was actually based on a mishearing of the name Osterman, though this remains unknown. And honestly, I think that sounds like a fairly realistic interpretation, given how similar the two words sound. After all, I suspect that in England, you're more likely to hear that someone is an Ulsterman than someone has the last name Osterman. There is, of course, one remaining mystery from this heist. The bulk of that £2.5 million was never recovered. The ultimate whereabouts of the majority of the money will likely never be known.